right. So welcome everyone. If you just signed on for the program today, this is a sort of a special edition, if you will, of our Sunday night gathering. And I'm so pleased that so many of you are interested in this sort of field. And of course, many people who join these calls as well as attend mindfulness gatherings, wherever you may be, are often maybe left a little bit with more questions about what are we doing? What are the roots of this tradition where we practice meditation, and what is Buddhism about? What on earth is it? We hear about it all the time. Well, maybe we don't, but um, so this is a great opportunity just to kind of revisit the origins. And I'm happy to take questions along the way, so we don't need to wait until the very end. And if we seem to be getting short on time, then probably I'll ask us to wait with questions until the end. Okay, so you should be able to unmute yourself if you're interested. So just jump on in, and what we're going to do is just move along. I wanted to have you sort of gaze and take in this first slide, since I love the colors on it. um, Oops, let's see. Okay, this is correct. Okay. So let's enter back into a time long, long ago. I'm going to do this as almost a picture book story. So if this is the last thing you do before bedtime, hopefully you'll have wonderful dreams tonight. Maybe even a Midsummer Night's Dream, who knows?
Mhm.
Or late summer. Okay, so the story of Buddhism begins with this young prince back in what we believe was at some point in the 6th or 5th century, 600, 500 BCE. And this is Prince Siddhartha Gautama, who was in the region that we now know to be southern Nepal, northern India. And I'm going to show you a map in a few slides of that area where he was born and where he did a lot of his teaching. His father was a great king called Shuddhodana, King Shuddhodana. And of course, Siddhartha, as a young prince, was very sheltered. And his father, King Shuddhodana, actually created places for Siddhartha where he would not have to be exposed to any kind of the world's troubles. And I'm noticing I misspelled Siddhartha. It has to have 2 D's on it. So if you're writing this down, make sure you write with 2 D's, not one. Um, so despite all of his father's attempts to shelter him from the suffering of the world, as anyone who's traveled in India knows, it's hard to avoid illness. It's hard to avoid actually the sort of the realities of living with illness, with conditions that maybe we're not accustomed to here in the West. And so one day, Siddhartha was coming to the palace. He was on his way, and he saw an old man in the street who was very ill and dying. And something stuck with him from that. Something actually was awakened in him, almost a curiosity. And I can only imagine from maybe perhaps a more Freudian view, how because his father was trying to shield him, I'm sure there was already some interest in what's beyond the palace walls. I don't know, I can't speak for him, but if you look at sort of some of the psychology, who knows, that may have happened. Um, so the Buddha kind of sat with this notion that his world that he was sheltered in was not the only reality, that there was a whole world of reality beyond the palace walls. And so one day he left his wife and his young children and set out. A lot of people have problems with that, by the way, that he would abandon his family, but they were well taken care of at the palace and by the royal family. And so he decided he needed to learn more, and so he left the palace and went into the world. Oh, here's the map, actually. So before we follow the Buddha's footsteps, um, as you can see, here is on this lower left corner of the slide, we have this region with all these colored dots. And here we see, this is largely India. Uttar Pradesh is the state of northern India. And here at southern Nepal, sort of at the top of this rectangle, is this area, it's sort of the foothills of this mountainous region where the Buddha was born. He was born in this town up here called Lumbini, which is at the very top, in red letters. And so this was sort of the region of India. The other notable town here is this one called Bodh Gaya. And this will become important in a few moments as kind of the location of the Buddha's awakening under the Bodhi tree. We'll talk about what that Bodhi tree is. But you can see here, this is largely the region where the Buddha lived and taught. And here is Siddhartha. This is sort of a lovely, colorful image at the palace with his wife. It looks as if this is a wedding. So we're now backing all the way up to before he left the palace. And life seemed pretty good, right? I wanted to show you this image too. This image, supposedly, so this was located in Taiwan by a Buddhist scholar. And some people think this was a painting. This was a realistic painting done by one of the Buddha's followers as to what he originally looked like when he was in his 40s. I haven't read too many accounts disputing this, probably because it's not easy to access. Although it is, I think more recently in the Museum of London is where you can go and see it. So if you're over there, get a better look at it, because this picture is a little grainy. It's not terribly easy to see it. Anyway, so this is kind of an open question about whether or not this actually looks like what the Buddha looked like. But supposedly, this is a copy, anyway, of something that sort of surfaced in East Asia and ended up in Taiwan. Okay, back to our story. The Buddha went into the world, and at that time in India, there was a revolution going on. There was a revolution taking place. And it had been already for quite some time, for hundreds of years. And that was the original, sort of the early Hindu sacrificial rituals, what we also call the Vedas, the texts that encompassed chanting and hymns to propitiate the deities, the gods, so that the whole cosmos would stay together. And the thinking was, if you got these chants wrong, you had to learn them perfectly. If you got them wrong, that the whole cosmos would come apart, and that the gods would be angry and it would come apart. So part of those rituals involved sacrifices of what are called soma leaves. So they would burn these leaves as a ritual offering to the deities and such. And so sacrifice, puja, what we call puja, P-U-J-A, are fire ceremonies, fire rituals that really had cosmic significance to maintain the well-being of the world, really. And somewhere around 1000 BCE, possibly a little sooner, this outer sacrifice began to transition to inner sacrifice. The inner sacrifice, the inner practice of exploring the nature of consciousness was seen to be kind of this new trend in spiritual practice. This happened over hundreds and hundreds of years before the Buddha. And so you had a tradition and a culture of ascetics, as we can see here from this image. I imagine they look quite a bit like they did then, possibly with the exception of this, what almost looks like these four wheels, like a car, although he's sitting on a bed of nails here. And so I don't know the purpose of those wheels, but hard to imagine him riding around the village on a bed of nails with wheels. I don't know how that works. So I don't know what this significance of that, those wheels are, but it is kind of interesting. So anyway, the Buddha, when he left the palace, he encountered so many different varieties of these ascetics and practices. You had the ancient yogic philosophy called Samkhya, Samkhya, this dualism between nature and matter and spirit, if you will, and consciousness. The Vedanta is another tradition that was sort of getting going during that period. The Vedanta is called the fifth Veda. The Vedas were the early texts that were passed down orally that basically encompassed hymns and stories and teachings and what we know about this ancient Hindu period of the pantheon of the deities and such, and how to also maintain the cosmos. And so the fifth Veda, Vedanta, became kind of that inner process of how do we practice purifying the body and purifying consciousness and the mind and everything. So the philosophy went internally largely. And that wasn't done by everyone. Of course, the Brahmanical class in India at the time maintained a lot of these kind of external Hindu rituals, and they do to this day, some of which are largely unchanged in remote areas of India and in the villages. So this was the context that the Buddha found himself in, and he began to study with various teachers, ascetic teachers, who were very trained and practiced in the art of deep esoteric meditative practices. And what he found was that there's a whole range of extremes that you can practice in. On one hand, you can practice excess. You can practice indulging in every excess and learning how to metabolize what comes from that and basically transcend worldly concerns. And what he found was that did not work very well. You know, it just established even more craving and more attachments. And at the other end of the spectrum, he practiced extreme asceticism. And here is a picture here of a sadhu, or a deep practitioner, who looks as if he's been fasting, and his ribs are very visible here. And the Buddha practiced this too, extreme fasting, to the point where he actually got very, very sick. And this was not a strange thing in India at the time. And he got so sick, and actually he was revived. The woman who brought him back to health, her name was Sujata, and she fed him this mixture of rice and milk that eventually began to bring him back to health. And what he realized from this was that the extremes are not the answer, but rather what needs to be cultivated is what we now know to be a middle path, the middle path of practice. That, you know, extremes just lead you down the wrong path, but this middle way is working within the world, within our tendencies, within these extremes, to cultivate a way through it and to essentially metabolize what we're experiencing. And that's the only way to transcend suffering, largely. Suffering which he encountered regularly on his wanderings. So this colorful image, the Buddha arrives at this place under what we know to be a banyan tree, B-A-N-Y-A-N, banyan, which you find often in this part of India. You can also find them, if you're local to Boston, at the Arnold Arboretum. I think they have a couple of banyan trees, and you can kind of go and take a look at it and imagine yourself sitting there, much like the Buddha did during his time. So he sat there for 49 days and vowed not to rise until he was awake. So by now he had learned all of these esoteric practices. He knew what consciousness was, as opposed to gross level, what we call the maras, or the temptations, the things that sort of would pull him back into a worldly life of suffering. And so he vowed to remain there until he could fully purify all of that, purify consciousness, and then emerged from this awakened. And so the first person he saw who asked him who he was, he said, "I am awake." He didn't say, "I am Siddhartha." He certainly didn't say, give any details, but that was how he saw himself at that point, was awake. He realized that he had fully realized. He realized his realization of who he ultimately was below all the excesses of mind. So, um, and he promptly began to go out and begin teaching. The first teaching that he did, and he gathered followers, was really on suffering. And so, in a way, it's kind of cool to draw these links between that initial experience he had entering the palace and seeing the man on the side of the road, and his very first teaching on suffering. That the first, what he calls the Four Noble Truths, are largely ubiquitous realities for all of us. That life is largely discontentedness, that we are doomed and destined to be discontented. And the word dukkha means discontentment, also pertains to suffering, right? So when we say suffering, just liberally we use the word suffering in Buddhism. He's really meaning discontent, that we're constantly going to be unhappy and dissatisfied with the changing nature of our lives. The things we want, we may have for a moment and then they go away. The things that we don't want feel like they're permanent and that we'll never be free from them. And so this constant back and forth, the cycle of what we call samsara, S-A-M-S-A-R-A, is this cycle of worldly existence that just revolves around and around. And it's laden with suffering, with discontent. So that's the bad news, right? It's not such a positive message. So that was the first noble truth. Now, we have three more to go here. The second was the cause. And we can actually think of the Four Noble Truths almost according to a medical model, that the first is the condition. The condition here is discontentedness or suffering. And the second one is the cause. The cause being clinging, desire, craving, largely needing things to be a certain way. And that also includes aversion and pushing other things away. So I want this, I don't want that. We're constantly, again, in this loss and gain frame of mind. And no one is free from this, right? That's our human dilemma. So the first is, life is this process of suffering and discontentedness. The second noble truth is that there is a cause here, and it's craving, clinging, need, desire, that kind of thing. And then the third becomes sort of the prognosis, which actually is quite good. So we have the diagnosis, we have the cause, and now we're on the prognosis, which is that there is a way out of this. There is a way out. And then the final one is the remedy. The remedy is the Noble Eightfold Path, or what's called the Eightfold Path. Sometimes it's called the Sacred Eightfold Path, and so on. And that there are 8 stages to Buddhist practice here that the Buddha realized on his own. So, for example, right view, right understanding is the first one, and that really is, how do we envision, how do we see, how do we cognize our life? How do we understand things to be? Do we understand them through the filter of suffering, or are we able to see them in what we might call more of a pure way of seeing that isn't laden with all of this, all the narratives and all the conditioning? So wisdom is kind of part of this. Right view, right understanding, seeing things in a way that is accurate and not sort of misinformed or erroneous or illusory. And the second noble truth is right resolve. Sometimes it's called right thought. So here, there is actually an interesting word called conation that we often use, conation. It's not a very common word, but conation, C-O-N-A-T-I-O-N, really sort of implies sort of a willful understanding of things, that there is a force to it. And I often find that that's a nice sort of balance word between resolve and thought, that our cognitions and the effort we put into things, our determination, are based often on our aspiration on this aspect of conating or conation. And then the third noble truth, right speech. Right speech. So what this means is basically not lying, of course, speaking truthfully, um, speaking accurately, and not gossiping, not just speaking needlessly, but a conservation of language, which uh, I can't be said that's one of my strengths because I always have something to say. Anyway, conserving speech and as well as noble silence. So knowing when speech is not warranted and valuing a space of noble silence. And then the fourth is right action or right conduct. And here is where the Buddha lays out the principles of how we are to live, how are we to respond, and our behavior is largely part of this as well. And then the fifth is right livelihood, right livelihood, that how we make a living or what we do to make a living matters. What we produce, what we bring into the world from the standpoint of livelihood really makes a difference. So for example, not killing, this was a very big part of that, which you can imagine the Kshatriya class in ancient India, which was a warrior class, were very high level. Um, this was probably a great conflict for them, if they even paid it any mind at all. So right livelihood, that what you do for a living to earn money um, must be rooted in wholesome aspiration. And if you think about this part of India where people were born into sort of livelihood legacies where they didn't often have much choice, this is a very sort of provocative and revolutionary way of thinking that people would have a choice here. But in fact, it was not go get another job. It was reflect on how you are making money, how you are making a living, and what you do in order to do so, and try to refrain from things that are unwholesome and cause suffering for yourself and others. Um, then right effort, that largely here we begin to see kind of the esoteric, the more kind of meditative practices or the concentrative practices. Right effort here is cultivating a sense of allowing, of what my teacher Leslie calls impeccability, and that um, largely relates to how is your energy balanced within your body. And so as we practice meditation, for example, are we actually contributing energy into the wrong things? Are we getting drawn off or feeding our suspicions and our narratives and our thoughts and creating even more of a spin in the mind? Or are we able to be effortless with what arises and cultivate a more of a sense of flow? So these last three are very much at the heart of our contemplative practice. And then the seventh is right mindfulness. And so right here at the very beginning, sati, the Pali word sati, S-A-T-I, which means literally remembering or that which is remembered. Here, it's a way of remembering. It's a way, in the words of John Kabat-Zinn, some of you were in my Tuesday extension school class, a way of being aware that on purpose, non-judgmentally and present. So a way of being aware of the present moment, non-judgmentally and with some clarity. And concentration, right? Concentration. The word samadhi is the word here. And here, it's not so much about, like when you study, if you're studying for an exam, you have to concentrate. But rather, it's more about the cultivation of wisdom that comes from a disciplined mind, a mind that is both disciplined and exhibiting right effort and right mindfulness. That out of that comes quality of wisdom. The word samadhi, which in Buddhism is translated as concentration, means something slightly different in yoga. And the yoga philosophy that the Buddha learned from and was steeped in, I think is still at the heart of this definition of concentration. Concentration here being one of more recognition of unity and interdependence, that kind of thing. So it's not just sort of a strong, attentive mind, but rather it's a realization of that mind, the mind that that is aware and awake ultimately. So, so that's the Eightfold Path. Um, People, he was known as the Buddha at this point, but there were also known to be Buddhas before the Buddha himself. And the term Buddha was largely about someone who had achieved a certain level of realization. And so there were other Buddhas before the Buddha, but he was then, by his followers, seen to be the Buddha with a capital THE. Uh, so the word Buddhism arises from that word, and he didn't necessarily say, okay, now we're practicing Buddhism, everyone, and here's what it looks like. But rather, he had this early community of monastics that included included women. And so at this point, I mean, I could go on lots of tangents around sort of the early monastic community, but I think one notable part of this is that the Buddha was asked, well, what about women being involved in the Sangha? Sangha. Sangha is a Pali and a Sanskrit word for the spiritual community. So this was the community of followers that included the Buddha himself and his followers and other monks and also nuns. And yet it was very controversial because at the time this was not appropriate for women to be in these roles of sort of spiritual cultivation and neglecting their duties in the world. And so the Buddha, there are accounts in the canon, in the Buddhist canon, where he was really conflicted about, not about whether or not women should be in the Sangha, but about how they would be received outside the Sangha. And he was very concerned that things might happen to them. And there was a real danger for women. And in some places in India, there still is. So my sense, if he was truly sort of an enlightened being, it wasn't, oh, you're a woman, you can't be part of this, but rather it's a good idea to think about the consequences. And of course, you have the capacity for enlightenment and teaching and practice and devotion and all of those things. But my feeling is that because he was so socially conscious, he was concerned. And so one of the sort of famous talks that the Buddha gave, and this is sort of what inspired the Zen view, was when the Buddha came out and had by now these throngs of followers who had come to hear him speak, and he didn't utter a word. He simply held up a lotus flower, and he didn't say anything. And the idea here is that I can sit and talk to you about teachings and enlightenment and all of this, but it doesn't mean you're going to get it. Instead, a direct experience, just like we practiced earlier, of suchness, of encountering fully the openness with a clear open mind of the experience, rather, with a clear open mind of the present moment, just as it is. And so this is the point he was trying to make, and became largely the roots of Zen Buddhism, the priorities of how we practice Zen Buddhism. Often it involves silent sitting, or zazen, Z-A-Z-E-N is a Japanese word, for simply sitting and encountering the present through a clear mind. So you don't see a lot of guided meditation like we do an awful lot of it here in our Sunday evenings. But anyway, we're not quite at how Buddhism traveled to these other regions. Right now, we're still in this part of northern India. And the early monastic community, where we actually have these, the teachings, the canon, the Buddhist canon handed down, was largely the preservers of the original Buddhist community, are still largely evident through one of the two main branches of Buddhism. So eventually, as Buddhism spread, as the Buddhist teachings, by the way, actually, he taught and traveled until he was 84. So he lived a long life, and also was very adept at medicinal, one of his nicknames was the Great Physician because he knew an awful lot about herbs and oils and ointments and foods. Um, so in the Buddhist canon, you can find just these expositions of his for this kind of ailment. This is the remedy. This is what you apply, um, and it can get pretty in depth. And so anyway, he displayed quite an impressive knowledge of also Ayurvedic medicine and a lot of the sort of ancient things. It's actually for a junkie like me, I just love looking at that and realizing, wow, this guy really, he wasn't just going around teaching meditation and compassion and love, but he was also attending to specifically to physical illnesses. People would come to him for all kinds of things. And even he was said to have had great esoteric powers to the point where one wealthy woman whose infant son passed away, she was utterly inconsolable and devastated by the death of her son. And she had heard that the Buddha could restore life, right? So she brought him to the Buddha and said, please bring my son back to life. I've heard you can do these great things. I am desperate. This is the story of Kisa Gotami. Some of you may have heard about Kisa Gotami. And so regardless of whether or not he could actually resurrect someone from the dead, which we find in a different tradition as well, he told her to go to every house in the village and collect a mustard seed from every house that had not known death, had not known great loss. And so, puzzled, she thought, okay, well, there must be a good reason. I trust him. She went from house to house and wasn't able to collect even one mustard seed. And all of a sudden, it's like the realization descended that this is actually, not only is this a ubiquitous part of living and dying, but others too are experiencing grieving and loss. And her heart was moved to compassion. And so in this process, she was moved. She could actually take her son to the charnel ground and burn the body. And then she became a nun right then and there. She went and followed the Buddha the rest of her life. And there are other stories with Kisa Gotami following around teaching as one of the earliest nuns that we know about in the Buddhist monastic period. So anyway, so you kind of see how the Buddha was trying to really teach a very practical way through, as opposed to just doing miracles, what are called siddhis, Siddhis. These are powers you get when you meditate regularly. I'm still waiting for them to show up, but nonetheless. Things like psychic abilities and being able to fly. I mean, you have these amazing stories of what's possible when you're fully realized. And of course, a lot of those are symbolic as well. So anyway, so the early monastic community maintained quite a large amount of following. The Buddha died when he was 84. And there was a period in India where Buddhism actually was basically eradicated. And I don't know a whole lot about that history, actually. I wish I could tell you more about it. But maybe someone here on the call knows sort of that part of the history. But largely, Buddhism began to take hold in other places. And so this early form of Buddhism we call Theravada Buddhism. Theravada is a Pali word. And it largely reflects the vehicle of Buddhism that is still quite a monastic priority of monastics. It's that the community is made up of monks and nuns and teachers, and that they actually provide services for the villages. So if you're in, say, Sri Lanka, or in Burma, or in Thailand, these are the areas where this form of Buddhism is still very, very popular. What we call the forest traditions, the forest Thai traditions. In Thailand, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, the Southeast Asia is largely the area where this form of Theravada Buddhism is seen, as well as in Sri Lanka. And in parts of India, there have been monasteries, viharas, which are monastic communities set up also back in India. And so it's largely has stayed true to these roots of Buddhism. And here, the ideal in Theravada Buddhism is called the Arhat, A-R-H-A-T. In Pali, it's Arhant with an A before the T. And the Arhat is the fully realized person who has practiced through various stages of absorption meditations called jhanas. Jhana, J-N-A-N-A, jhanas. And those are like absorptions or sort of stages of cultivating in meditation, as well as attending to villages and communities through rituals. A lot of what they do is chanting. You know, it's not all about meditation. In fact, very little of Buddhist practice involves meditation. Whereas here in the West, this is what we know. This is like the part we want. We want the good stuff first, right? We want to know how to sit and alleviate our suffering and maybe even attain some familiarity with what's beneath our suffering and our mindful awareness. So, so anyway, these monks we have at Harvard Divinity School, we've been blessed to have many of these largely Theravada monks coming from particularly Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. And they have just utterly enhanced our community by being here, just utterly amazing people. And for those of you in the extension school course that I'm teaching, Tajay, our TF, was one of these monks. So he came from Bangladesh and from Sri Lanka. I think he was born in Bangladesh and came from Sri Lanka. And when he came to us, he was robed. He was a robed monastic. Amazing, amazing young man. Here's another picture of an older monk, probably in the Thai forest tradition, possibly around in a temple someplace. Then we also, the second major strand of Buddhism is called Mahayana, Mahayana Buddhism. So these still, to this day, and actually during this period after the Buddha's death, there were several various strands. We're not going to get into that. The Sarvastivadi Buddhists, the Madhyamikas, you know, what makes those different? That's a whole nother thing. That would take hours to unpack. But these two main traditions of Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana, Mahayana is then the second one. The word Mahayana, Maha means great or large. Yana means vehicle. So Mahayana is the greater vehicle. It's the form of Buddhism that anyone can practice. You don't have to be a monastic. You don't have to go off and practice in a forest monastery to get enlightenment, but anyone, even a householder, is able to cultivate Buddhism and learn from the monks and from the monastics and so on. And largely in areas where Mahayana is more prevalent, largely fulfilling many of the same functions, attending to the community and listening to the sorrows of the people and helping with festivals. And what's interesting about Mahayana Buddhism is also the various forms that it took as it evolved out of this part of, as it evolved into places like Tibet and into East Asia. And so so this picture here, these are what we call yellow hat monks. So in Mahayana, in Tibetan Buddhism, there are also many different strains there. The yellow hats are affiliated with a Gelugpa, which is the Dalai Lama, his lineage of Buddhism. Dalai Lama is sort of the father of Tibetan Buddhism, but he's actually only one of many sort of eminent leaders. The other large one that people may have heard of is the Karmapa. And I'll have a picture of him in a moment. But the one who brought Buddhism to Tibet, actually, was Padmasambhava. Padmasambhava. Padma, P-A-D-M-A, Sambhava, S-A-M-B-H-A-V-A, Padmasambhava. And he lived somewhere around the 700s in CE, so not BCE, but this was over 1,000 years after the Buddha, in the 8th century. And he was an Indian yogi who brought Buddhism to Tibet. And what had been in Tibet before that was something called Bon, B-O-N, and the O has a little umlaut over it, a little diacritical mark. Bon was more of a shamanic religion. So some people may know about Native Americans, perhaps, or in South America, sort of the native indigenous tribes. Well, there was something similar here in the Tibetan Himalayas, and so Buddhism basically came into Tibet and fused with some of the practices that were more earth-centered. And so you do find practices where these esoteric practices taught by the Buddha fused with these more shamanic areas, as well as some of the tantric and the Hindu pantheon of deities. So in Tibetan Buddhism, you see actually quite a bit of gods and goddesses and deities and what we call bodhisattvas. Um, Mahayana is that which really prizes the state of compassion, that this is the ideal. And the one who cultivates themselves um, with the aspiration to free sentient beings from suffering, for all living beings from suffering, and is willing to sort of hold the line and not sort of go all the way into enlightenment, but turn back around for the benefit of all beings, is seen to be the bodhisattva. That is a figure. You don't have to be a monk to do this. You can be just a person who exemplifies so much compassion, and through responding to the suffering in the world through compassion, you actually, your own progress is enhanced in the Dharma. So that was, so Padmasambhava was a huge figure. He is actually seen to be like the second Buddha, you know, among Tibetan Buddhists. That's how important he was to bring the teachings and so on. And other teachers later then came. We've been doing the Lojong slogans in our Sunday night. Atisha was another saint, quote unquote, who brought the mind training teachings north into Tibet, sort of the northeast. But there was another strain that traveled from what we would call sort of the Eurasian area, north of India, over, I think along the Silk Road, over towards China. And the one who was charged with this was a very irascible sort of antinomian figure called Bodhidharma. Bodhidharma. And so you'll often see in Chinese Buddhism, you'll often see pictures of this kind of crazy looking guy. He's overweight, he has a little goatee and always looks angry. And that's often going to be Bodhidharma, this incredible figure who brought Buddhism to China. And in China, you had, you already had Confucianism and Taoism there. But when Buddhism entered into the picture, you had all of these teachings sort of fusing together into this sort of three-part framework for how people thought and lived and practiced between Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. And so Bodhidharma, this happened actually before Buddhism entered Tibet. This was sort of around the 5th, 6th century. So probably about 100 or 200 years before the Tibetans actually received, before Padmasambhava went to Tibet. So in China, you had something called Chan, C-H-A-N. That was the form of Buddhism that traveled there, which came from a lineage. So Bodhidharma was largely the father of what we call Zen. And he brought this mind-only lineage of Buddhism that evolved into Zen. So the word Chan, which became Chinese Buddhism specifically, is a Chinese pronunciation of dhyana, dhyana, D-H-Y-A-N-A, which is a Sanskrit word for meditation. So dhyana became Chan in China. Same thing, same word. So Chan, as it then spread into Korea, Vietnam, and Japan, became Zen. So it's the Japanese pronunciation of Chan. So Chan being dhyana, and Zen also being Chan. And so you had this sort of unfolding largely of what we now know to be Zen Buddhism that sort of filled the whole East Asian area. And there was another strand of Buddhism that came more from the Tibetan view through that part of the region of China in the Tibetan Plateau, where you also have something called Pure Land Buddhism. Pure Land is the more devotional, form of Buddhism with some of the deities that you found in Tibetan Buddhism. And so there was that other strand that entered China from that way. So you had these kind of different strands of Buddhism moving into East Asia. So those are the still to this day the most prevalent forms of Buddhism in East Asia are the Chan. The Chinese Buddhism is Chan, Pure Land, sort of hybrid, and also Zen and Tiandai and other forms of Japanese Buddhism that you find in Japan and other regions like Korea. Korea is a huge Zen sort of preserver of Dharma. This picture I like. This is a group of nuns. You rarely see them laughing and sort of dancing and joking about. I've been in several monasteries, and when I was in Vancouver for 3 weeks, I had the privilege of visiting probably close to 20 different monasteries and having lunch at many of them. The food is unparalleled in these places too. And there was only one occasion where I saw people dancing and being lively, and that was when a Vietnamese master brought out his guitar because he'd heard that I played guitar and asked me to play something. And so I started playing the Medicine Buddha chant, and everyone started singing and kind of moving, and it was like, wow, it totally changed the whole energy. It was very cool. So this last slide here of Mahayana Buddhism is just, it's a group of monks. And the one in the center, does anybody have any guesses who this might be? This is the Karmapa. Karmapa. So you know how the Dalai Lama is the head of, well, we would say he's the head of Tibetan Buddhism, but he's actually the head of a certain lineage of Tibetan Buddhism. The Gelugpa Nyingma are two Tibetan Buddhist lineages. This Karmapa is at the same level of the Dalai Lama, only it's a different strand of Tibetan Buddhism called Karma Kagyu, the Kagyu tradition. So in Tibetan Buddhism, we have Nyingma, Kagyu, Gelugpa, Sakya lineage, and then there's a more obscure lineage. A good friend of mine is the head of that lineage, Zurmang, the Zurmang tradition, which is more based in Sikkim, in the hills and the mountains of Sikkim. So he was actually an extension school student of mine. That's how I met him. I didn't know who he was, and he appeared in my class. This very quiet man, dressed very humbly. One day a friend of mine said, "Oh, I think Zorman Garwang is in your class." And I said, "Yeah, I think so." And I didn't know who he was. She goes, "Well, you do know who he is." Now, the person telling me this was a Lama Willa Miller, who's a friend of mine. I said, "No, who is it?" And she said, "Oh, well, he's the lineage holder for the international, and he's a prince. He's a prince of Sikkim as well." And so I walked back into class the next day, and I was like, I'm teaching this guy Buddhism? I'm teaching him mindfulness? Are you kidding me? So I was always like, "Zormang, did I get that right? Is that right? Is that your understanding?" It's like, he would be like, "Yeah, very good, very good." So lovely man. And actually then after the class, the next time I saw him, he came to HDS and he was in his full robes with a whole entourage of people. He had gold, gold vajras and stuff all over him. He looked like an entirely different person. It was very cool. Anyway, so side note, this is a Japanese Zen practitioner, monk in the Zendo, and you can kind of see the images are slightly different. The background here in the Zen is very simple. Often you'll have these soji screens or sliding doors. I personally really like the aesthetic. We could do a whole thing on the aesthetics of these different traditions. But I very much like the Zen aesthetic. It's very simple. It's very sort of bright and clean and so on. Oh, we are at the end here, aren't we? So anyway, this was just kind of an overview here of how how Buddhism kind of got going and spread around the world, and we could spend a lot more time on a lot of different parts of it. And I promised you guys that, let's see, what time is it now? We still have a little time. That I would also talk about kind of how I've been influenced by Buddhism and the approach that I take when I teach. And we don't have to spend much time on that. And certainly if you guys have questions, we can take questions as well. But I would say, in short, that for me, what's been probably the most influential for me is twofold. It has to do with contemplative practice and how that impacts the work I do off the cushion in the world. Also the livelihood, the teaching that I do, the chaplaincy work I've done, the counseling, all of those things, as well as the music with Sadigata that we've been doing for the last few years. So for me, the teachings are really ripest when I'm on the cushion, whether it's the teachings on mindfulness, uh, the teachings on Tonglen and compassion, or the teachings on luminosity and the mind that we find in the Lankavatara Sutra and a lot of the texts that focus on like the perfection of wisdom and what that means. My influences have also been very much informed by Advaita Vedanta. And so that may be the subject of a different evening that we do. We dive into Vedanta, which is a very fascinating and a long history of philosophy that is really focused in non-duality. And what we find in the Vajrayana, which I forgot to talk about, the Vajrayana, but that's the tantric form of Buddhism that you find in Tibetan Buddhism largely, and in a bit in some of the Chinese Buddhist masters too. But how that incorporates working to metabolize, whatever it is we're working with in the world, whether it's suffering or joy or complexity, as well as the potential that we hold to really transform our minds in a short period of time, that it is possible to cultivate intentionally if we really put our minds to it, so that we begin to experience ourselves more as that which is bearing witness to life rather than that which is caught up in it. And so always coming back to practicing, having a realization of open awareness of pure consciousness. So I've been doing this for many years. I've had amazing experiences and amazing teachers, and really sort of re-encounter all of that when I'm on retreat, when I do my solitude at home. And so when we do our classes, one of the things the Sunday night group is really putting to the test the teachings and seeing if they're true for us. So as we've been going through the 7-point mind training, for example, every time we've done one or two points from the 59 slogans, we actually try to put it into practice on the cushion. It's not just an idea or a philosophy or something nice we can think about that make us feel better, but really it's about sort of self-transforming, and how can we rely on the mind, on the underlying nature of mind, to help sort of heal the wounding of the gross level mind, the suffering mind that we're encountering pretty much 24/7, many of us in the world. So anyway, that my interest here is certainly in teaching, is to help garner and create the conditions for a really auspicious experience on the cushion. Because my experience has been those experiences actually lead to sort of a longer lasting benefit off the cushion until we get embroiled back in the world again, and then repeating again. It's like we re-encounter perhaps in a different way those experiences. And once again, it's almost like a pearl of a necklace made out of pearls, that if you have pearls spaced really far apart on the necklace, the interim between the pearls will drop down quite a bit. Pardon me. And if the pearls are situated close together, then there's less sagging between the pearls, and you have this kind of a thing. And so really encouraging regular practice. It's why I have the videos. It's why we post the videos on the YouTube channel. So my throat chakra is closing up, which means it's time for questions.